What would you do if someone tried to steal your home, your family's legacy, right out from under you? Not a stranger, not the government, but a homeowners association you never even joined? For 6 generations, my family has lived on this land. My great-great-great-grandfather, Elijah Carter, built this house with his own 2 hands just after the Civil War, when most of the land around here was still scorched earth. He turned down every offer to sell, choosing instead to rebuild from the ashes and raise his family here. Over the decades, my ancestors fought through war, economic collapse, and urban expansion, but never once did they surrender our home. My father, Bill Carter, was the latest in that long line of stubborn men who saw this land as more than just property. It was blood, sweat, and history. Growing up, my father was tough, the kind of man who worked from dawn to dusk without complaint. He never had the chance to go to college, but he made damn sure his kids did. He built us up, made us proud of where we came from, and instilled in us a deep, unshakable respect for this home. Even when the city crept closer and developers started throwing 7-figure offers at our feet, we never wavered. Turning down real estate agents became something of a sport in our family. I kept copies of every rejected offer, tacking them up like trophies on my office wall. But one day, the letter came. Unlike the others, this one wasn't an offer, it was a demand. It was from the HOA of a neighborhood I didn't even belong to, claiming I owed 5 years of unpaid dues and that a lien had been placed on my home. I remember reading that letter over and over, thinking it had to be some kind of joke. But at the bottom, signed in ink, was the name Karen. And just like that, a war began. I didn't waste a second. The moment I finished reading that ridiculous letter, I grabbed my keys and drove straight into enemy territory, the pristine, cookie-cutter suburb where the HOA reigned supreme. The houses were nearly identical, all painted in shades of beige and lined with well-manicured lawns that screamed uniformity. The streets were quiet, unnaturally so, as if even the air itself had to follow some unspoken set of HOA regulations. I pulled up to the address listed at the bottom of the letter. The house was just like the others, over-landscaped, aggressively symmetrical, and completely soulless. But the car in the driveway, a spotless luxury sedan with a vanity plate that read, Karen 1, told me exactly who I was dealing with. I rang the doorbell, waiting. The seconds stretched out, but finally, the door swung open. Karen stood there, radiating the kind of confidence only possessed by people who had never been told no in their lives. Everything about her, from the stiff blonde curls that didn't move an inch to the fake smile stretched across her heavily powdered face, reeked of artificiality. "Ah, Mr. Carter," she said, tilting her head in what I'm sure she thought was a condescendingly polite gesture. "I was wondering when you'd stop by. I didn't waste time on pleasantries." I pulled the letter from my jacket pocket and laid it flat on the polished glass table in her foyer. "Explain this," I said. Karen barely glanced at it before pressing her lips into a tight, insufferable smile. "Oh, that," she said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "That's simply standard HOA procedure. You see, after your father passed, he made sure his land was protected by joining our HOA. This letter is just notifying you of your outstanding dues. It's all very routine." I clenched my jaw. "My father never signed this land into an HOA, I said, my voice sharp. "I'd bet my life on it." Karen's expression didn't waver. "I completely understand how difficult it must be to lose a parent," she said, as if she were consoling a child rather than trying to rob me blind. "But I'm afraid the paperwork is very clear." "Then show me the contract," I demanded. For the first time, Karen hesitated. It was subtle, just a flicker of uncertainty behind her eyes, but I caught it. She recovered quickly, smoothing out her already flawless blouse. "I don't see why that would be necessary," she said. I crossed my arms. "Because I'm not leaving until I see it." She exhaled sharply, clearly irritated that I wasn't rolling over like whatever poor suburban suckers she usually bullied into submission. "Fine," she said, spinning on her heels and disappearing into a side room. She returned a few minutes later with a neatly stapled packet of official-looking documents. At the bottom of the top page was a signature that was supposed to be my father's. I stared at it. My father had been many things: a hard worker, a proud man, a stubborn bastard, but he had never, not once, changed the way he signed his name. And the signature on this paper? It was close, but it wasn't his. Worse still, I recognized the date on the document. It was the exact day my father had been in surgery, fighting for his life. He had been under anesthesia for hours. There was no way in hell he had signed anything that day. I felt my blood turn to ice. "This is a forgery," I said, my voice low, dangerous. Karen didn't even flinch. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said smoothly. "But the contract is legally binding. If you fail to pay the outstanding dues, the HOA will have no choice but to move forward with the lien." I felt my fists clench at my sides. She was lying through her teeth, and she knew it. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You and I both know this is fake," I said. "And if you think I'm just going to hand over my home because of some fabricated contract, you're dead wrong." Karen's smile stretched wider. "Well, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I suppose we'll see about that." I stormed out of her house, rage burning in my chest. My first call was to my lawyer. My second was to a private investigator. Karen had declared war on the wrong man. By the time I got home, I was already making plans. Karen thought she could lie, cheat, and bully her way into stealing my home. She thought she could forge a signature, slap some official-looking papers together, and I'd just roll over and accept it. She had no idea who she was messing with. My lawyer, Rick Hamilton, answered on the second ring. He didn't even sound surprised when I told him what was happening. "I've seen HOAs try a lot of underhanded things," he said, his voice sharp with irritation. "But forging a contract to steal a man's land? That's a new low." "I need this handled," I said. "Fast." Rick agreed to start pulling records, but before I could even strategize my next move, Karen escalated. The very next morning, I woke up to an official notice taped to my door, one from the city's code enforcement department. Apparently, my home, the same house that had stood for over 150 years, was now deemed a hazard due to non-compliance with modern HOA safety and aesthetic standards. I didn't even have time to process the sheer absurdity of that before another letter showed up, this one citing multiple noise complaints from my property. And if that wasn't enough, later that afternoon, I received a call from the zoning office. Someone had reported me for operating an unlicensed business on my land. The accusation? That I was illegally farming without a permit. I wasn't farming a damn thing. I didn't need to ask who was behind it. Karen had found a new way to attack, weaponizing the system to drown me in bureaucracy. The next few weeks were hell. Code enforcement officers showed up unannounced, citing ridiculous violations. One actually had the audacity to suggest I should repaint my barn in approved HOA colors. When I pointed out, again, that I wasn't part of the HOA, he just shrugged, saying the complaint came from a concerned neighborhood representative. It got worse. A real estate agent showed up at my house. At first, I thought he was just another vulture trying to make an offer, but then he mentioned a listing. My house had been put up for sale. By the HOA. Without my permission. Without my knowledge. The agent, confused but polite, said that Karen had listed the property under HOA oversight and that they were preemptively securing a buyer due to my non-compliance. I nearly lost it right there on my porch. I drove straight back to Karen's house, my anger boiling over. I pounded on her door, and when she finally opened it, she had the nerve to smile. "Ben," she said, like we were old friends. "I assume you got the notices?" I shoved the real estate listing in her face. "What the hell is this?" She barely glanced at it. "Oh, that? Standard HOA procedure. Since you've refused to pay your dues and bring your property into compliance, we've had to take necessary measures." "Necessary measures?" My voice was dangerously low. "You're trying to sell my house." Karen's smile didn't falter. "It's not your house anymore, Ben. You forfeited it the moment you refused to follow the rules." I took a step closer, barely restraining myself. "You forged my father's signature. You filed fake complaints against me. You're harassing me through the city. And now, you think you can just take my home?" Karen tilted her head, her smile widening. "Well, Mr. Carter, I suppose that's for the courts to decide." I stared at her, my fury barely contained. "Then I'll see you in court." And I meant it. The courtroom was packed. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table with her high-priced attorney, Jeffrey Simmons, a man who looked like he charged by the breath. He adjusted his tie with an air of confidence, as if he'd already won before the trial even began. Karen, for her part, sat with her hands folded neatly on the table, her smug expression never wavering. Meanwhile, I sat next to my lawyer, Rick, who had a stack of documents in front of him so thick it could have been used as a murder weapon. Karen had no idea what was coming. The judge called the session to order, and Jeffrey wasted no time launching into his argument. He painted me as an irresponsible homeowner, someone who had repeatedly violated HOA guidelines, refused to pay fees, and even assaulted Karen in her own home. He theatrically motioned toward his client, who put on a practiced look of distress. "Your Honor," Jeffrey said, his voice dripping with false concern, "not only has Mr. Carter neglected his civic duty as a resident of our community, but he has also exhibited alarming aggression toward my client. The HOA was left with no choice but to place a lien on his property in an effort to recoup unpaid fees. This is a simple matter of contract enforcement." Rick let him finish, watching with calm amusement. Then, when it was his turn, he stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the contract my opposing counsel is referring to is a fraud. And we can prove it." The courtroom shifted, a murmur rippling through the crowd. Karen stiffened. Rick turned to the judge. "We'd like to introduce Exhibit A, Mr. Carter's father's medical records." He walked up to the bench and handed over a set of neatly printed documents. "As you'll see, the day he allegedly signed this contract, he was in surgery under general anesthesia. He was physically incapable of signing anything." Karen's smug expression cracked for the first time. Jeffrey shifted in his seat. "That doesn't prove." Rick held up a hand. "Exhibit B, a forensic analysis of the signature in question, compared to multiple verified documents signed by Mr. Carter's father over the years. The expert's report confirms the signature was forged." The judge narrowed his eyes, flipping through the pages. "Go on." Rick smiled. "And then there's Exhibit C, a collection of rejection letters sent by my client, years of documented refusals to join the HOA." He motioned toward the evidence table, where we had neatly displayed every single letter I had ever sent to Karen. The judge exhaled sharply. "This is quite damning." Karen's face was a perfect mask of barely concealed panic. But Rick wasn't done. "And finally, Exhibit D, HOA financial records obtained through discovery. We found something interesting, Your Honor, misappropriated funds. HOA fees that were supposed to go toward community improvements, but instead, they were redirected to accounts under Karen's personal control. She's been using HOA funds for personal vacations, shopping sprees, and spa treatments." The entire courtroom erupted. Gasps filled the air as Karen's perfectly curated image shattered like glass. The judge rapped his gavel for silence. Then, turning to Jeffrey, he asked, "Does your client have a response?" Jeffrey looked at Karen, waiting for her to speak. For the first time, she had nothing to say. After a painfully long silence, the judge sighed. "I have heard enough." He turned to face me. "Mr. Carter, the lien on your property is officially null and void. Furthermore, I am referring the issue of financial misconduct to the state attorney's office for further investigation." I glanced at Karen, watching as all the color drained from her face. She hadn't just lost the case, she had walked herself straight into criminal charges. She tried to speak, to stammer out some excuse, but it was over. And I had won. Karen never saw it coming. She had spent years bullying, manipulating, and stealing, convinced that her authority was absolute. But the moment she walked into that courtroom with her fake contracts, forged signatures, and fabricated claims, she had already lost. The fraud case against her exploded overnight. The HOA members, her once loyal subjects, turned on her the second they saw where their money had really been going. Lavish vacations, shopping sprees, expensive meals, all paid for with their fees. The community demanded answers, but Karen had none. She was too busy fighting criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. She resigned from the HOA in disgrace, but it wasn't enough. The state pressed charges. As the case moved forward, she drained whatever savings she had left trying to fight it. The last I heard, she was facing serious jail time. The HOA collapsed under the weight of the scandal, with members scrambling to elect new leadership. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I had bigger things to celebrate. I stood on my porch the day the judge's ruling officially cleared the lien. My home, the same house my great-great-great-grandfather built with his own hands, was mine again. No fraudulent contracts, no threats, no HOA breathing down my neck. The land had survived wars, economic collapses, and generations of greedy developers. And now, it had survived Karen. A neighbor, one who had once stayed silent, walked up to me that evening. He nodded toward the land and said, "You really saved this place. Your father would be proud." That was all I needed to hear. But the truth is, this isn't just my story. HOA nightmares like this happen more often than people realize. Have you ever had an HOA, or a Karen, try to take something from you? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.